The infinite war had raged for millennia. Civilizations rose and fell, entire species wiped from existence, and yet the conflict endured, a never-ending cycle of destruction fueled by ancient hatreds, resource disputes, and the cold, mechanical efficiency of war machines that no longer knew peace. The dominant powers of the galaxy, the hfy Dominion and the Corthan Ascendancy, had long since given up on conventional victory. Their war had become a contest of endurance, with both sides employing brutal, unspeakable methods to outlast the other. Humanity had not been meant to survive. The Terran Union had been a fledgling power when the Infinite War reached their sector of the galaxy. A minor, ambitious species with a knack for survival, but utterly outclassed by civilizations that had been waging war for thousands, sometimes millions, of years. At first, the great empires dismissed them as irrelevant, barely worth the time it took to crush their scattered colonies beneath orbital bombardments. That was their first mistake. Humanity did not break under pressure. They did not surrender when their fleets were shattered, when their homeworld was targeted, when their allies abandoned them for safer, more submissive options. No, the humans adapted. They survived. And somehow, against all odds, they endured. The infinite war had ravaged thousands of species, but the humans thrived in chaos. Their military doctrine was unconventional, their tactics unpredictable. Where other species followed rigid, traditional warfare, the humans innovated. They weaponized desperation, turning every asteroid, every debris field, every failed colony into a strategic advantage. At first, the hfy and Corthan barely noticed. Humanity was nothing but an insect caught in a hurricane, insignificant against the greater forces at play. But then the war dragged on. And humanity refused to die. The first signs of their uncanny resilience came when human ships, cobbled together from salvaged wreckage, began striking Corthan supply lines. Guerrilla warfare tactics that should have been ineffective against an empire's might instead became a growing plague. Then came the ghost fleets, human vessels with no official allegiance, striking deep behind enemy lines, crippling war factories, and vanishing before retaliation could be mustered. The warlords of both factions scoffed. Humanity's stubbornness was a nuisance at best, an irritant in the grand scheme of the infinite war. That was their second mistake. Because the humans were learning. They were watching. And they were waiting. When the first Corthan war world fell, completely cut off and sabotaged from within, the hfy assumed it was internal sabotage. When entire Dominion battle groups were lured into star systems that became their graves, it was blamed on strategic oversight. But as more and more incidents piled up, as human-led resistance groups spread across war-torn systems, the great empires began to realize the truth. Humanity had stopped being prey. They had become something else. In the dying embers of the old powers, humanity found a purpose, not just survival, but domination through sheer perseverance. They became an unrelenting force, striking wherever the great empires faltered, slipping through the cracks of a war that had long since forgotten what victory even meant. And then, with the galaxy in turmoil, humanity did the impossible. They turned the infinite war against itself. They played the great powers against one another, exacerbating tensions, dismantling supply lines, and ensuring that no peace could ever take hold. The war that had existed for millennia now had a new master, a silent orchestrator that refused to be recognized until it was too late. Humanity was no longer a minor species struggling to survive. They were the shadow in the void. The storm that never ceased. And for the first time in eons, the great empires of the galaxy felt something they had not known for generations. Fear. For eons, the hfy Dominion had ruled supreme. Their empires spanned across the stars, their technology and knowledge unmatched. But they had overlooked a singular truth, humanity's adaptability. The Corthan Ascendancy, likewise, had made their own assumptions, believing that the war against an upstart species would be over before it ever truly began. Now, both realized how wrong they were. The unassuming, scrappy human race had become a real threat, one they could no longer ignore. It began slowly at first. The hfy's most seasoned warlords, accustomed to overseeing the destruction of entire civilizations, started noticing the strange, almost impossible coordination of human forces. Rebel factions across war zones began adopting more sophisticated tactics. Human saboteurs disabled entire Dominion battalions with guerrilla precision. Meanwhile, human fleets, crafted from scavenged wreckage and makeshift materials, executed lightning strikes against Korthan fortresses, forcing the Ascendancy to divert precious resources from their conquest. A series of successful assaults left the Dominion and Ascendancy scrambling. The Korthan, whose fleets once dominated with impunity, were losing ships at an alarming rate, and their supply chains, once thought to be indestructible, were crumbling under a sustained human onslaught. The great leaders of both factions convened in secret. Their war had been endless, but humanity's survival had shifted it into an entirely new phase. To them, this was no longer a battle for resources or glory, it was a battle for dominance. Humanity had taken the first step in what appeared to be an inevitable march towards supremacy. "Perhaps it is time," said Lord Ikar of the Va Shar Dominion, his voice sharp as the crack of a whip. "Perhaps we should join forces. An alliance, to eliminate this pest before it grows beyond control." "An alliance," replied Warlord Rak of the Korthan, his reptilian eyes narrowing. "The Va Shar, those whose pride led them to the brink of extinction? I trust nothing of your kind, Ikar. But perhaps we share a common enemy now." The Va Shar leader smirked, his scaled face twisting with arrogance. "If you wish to perish fighting humans alone, by all means, Rak. But I believe it is in your best interest to listen. Humanity will not stop. If we don't move now, we risk the entire galaxy falling to their ingenuity." Their meetings, shrouded in secrecy, led to a new directive, the eradication of humanity. They would combine forces and launch a joint campaign, an offensive so powerful that no human resistance could survive. The Dominion and the Ascendancy, bitter rivals for centuries, set aside their differences for a common cause, to crush this unexpected adversary before it could grow into an existential threat. But humanity was already prepared. A galactic intelligence network, formed by human operatives from every corner of the galaxy, intercepted the communications of the Va Shar and Korthan fleets. Word spread quickly through the scattered human colonies. They knew what was coming. They understood that this was no longer about survival, it was about something far more dangerous. The leaders of the Terran Union gathered. The war had taken an unexpected turn, but the time for uncertainty had passed. Humanity had reached its tipping point. There would be no retreat. Admiral Jane Ironheart Korvac, leader of the human fleet, spoke to her council. "This isn't just about winning a war. This is about our place in the universe. We've fought too long and too hard to let these ancient empires dictate our future. They believe we are ants beneath their boots, but we will show them how fierce an ant can be when it refuses to die." Under her command, humanity forged alliances of their own, uniting independent resistance factions across the galaxy. They had learned to be more than just survivors. They had become disruptors, masters of the unseen art of war, and they were ready to take the fight to the heart of the Va Shar and Korthan empires. The war had escalated. A new, brutal phase had begun, and now, the great empires of the galaxy would learn that they had awakened a force far more dangerous than they had ever imagined. Humanity was no longer just a thorn in their side. They were the tip of the spear, driving into the heart of the infinite war. The joint offensive was swift, calculated, and devastating. The Va Shar and Korthan empires, now united under the banner of mutual destruction, unleashed their full might upon humanity. Planetary bombardments, orbital blockades, and unrelenting starship fleets descended on the last bastions of human resistance. The Dominion and Ascendancy had no illusions, they believed that humanity's defeat was inevitable. The first wave of the offensive hit human-held systems with unrestrained ferocity. The Va Shar's plasma cannons ripped through planetary shields, their capital ships decimating any human vessel they encountered. The Korthan, whose war machines were engineered for relentless conquest, swept across the battlefronts with brutal efficiency. It seemed as though humanity's time had come. But as the first reports of destruction reached the human command center, a quiet realization spread through the ranks of the Terran Union: they were prepared. Admiral Jane Korvac stood on the bridge of her flagship, the U.S. Valiant, her expression unwavering. A holographic display of the Galactic theater before her showed the sweeping devastation, but there was no panic in her demeanor. Instead, she issued orders with precision, a master of tactics whose strategies had evolved from the very nature of human survival. "Deploy the decoy fleets," she commanded. "Activate the deep space mines and reinforce the secondary positions. Make them think we're falling apart." As the Korthan and Va Shar closed in on their targets, humanity's cunning began to unravel the strategy of their seemingly indomitable foes. Human ships, seemingly retreating under overwhelming pressure, shifted course at the last moment, leading their enemies into carefully laid traps. The decoy fleets, composed of damaged or intentionally decommissioned ships, drew the enemy into kill zones, where human commandos and surprise tactics exploited their weaknesses. For every planet the Va Shar and Korthan obliterated, a dozen more human fighters emerged from the shadows to strike back with vicious resolve. It wasn't victory yet, but it was survival, and for the first time, it felt as though the war might turn. It was a game of deception, and humanity had become its masters. But it wasn't just the military strategy that had shifted the tide. A new force was rising, something the Va Shar and Korthan had never fully anticipated: betrayal within their own ranks. The Va Shar Dominion, a highly hierarchical society, was not immune to internal dissent. The war, once a proud symbol of their might, had become a grinding, endless conflict. The bloodshed and suffering had taken their toll on the Dominion's generals, and the once unified factions now found themselves fractured. Whispers of revolt spread through the ranks, sowing doubt. On a remote Va Shar warworld, a high-ranking officer named Thrain had grown disillusioned with the war. He had seen too many of his comrades slaughtered in the name of a cause that seemed ever more futile. The endless conflict, the endless destruction, it had all begun to feel meaningless. When he intercepted a message from human resistance cells offering peace in exchange for alliance, he knew that this could be the opportunity to end the war for good. Thrain, secretly allied with humanity, began leaking crucial intelligence to the Terran Union, tipping them off about upcoming Dominion offensives. He sabotaged Va Shar fleet maneuvers, ensuring that humanity could exploit weaknesses in the enemy's strategies. This act of betrayal was a seismic shift in the war, one that would prove far more devastating than any weapons humanity could deploy. On the other side of the galaxy, Korthan leaders faced their own fractures. The war was draining resources at an unsustainable rate. The cost of maintaining their vast war machines was breaking the Ascendancy's economy, and cracks were forming within the leadership. One such crack emerged in the form of General Tarkar, a Korthan warlord who had long been loyal to his people but found himself questioning the Ascendancy's blind pursuit of dominance. Tarkar had witnessed firsthand the horrors the Korthan had unleashed on the human colonies. And though his people were ferocious in their conquest, even they could not ignore the mounting cost. Tarkar, in a daring move, made contact with the human underground, offering his fleet services in exchange for a promise of autonomy for his people after the war. His forces, along with Thrain's sabotage, began to unravel the once impenetrable Korthan war machine. The alliance between humanity and these fractured factions was forged in secrecy, a web of conspiracy that weakened the once mighty empires from within. By the time the Dominion and Ascendancy realized the depth of the treachery that had plagued their ranks, it was too late. The human resistance, once seen as a nuisance, had become a formidable force, not only defeating their enemies on the battlefield but destabilizing the very foundations of their ancient adversaries. The battlefront had become a shifting, unpredictable landscape where no one knew who their true allies were anymore. But the war was far from over. Humanity had made its move, but now, the Va Shar and Korthan would come to understand that the real threat was not the human fleet. It was the relentless ingenuity, the adaptability, and the spirit of a species that refused to be conquered. The battlefield stretched out before humanity like a vast chessboard, with pieces scattered across the stars. In every corner of the galaxy, the once overwhelming might of the Va Shar and Korthan empires was crumbling under the weight of betrayal, strategic brilliance, and the relentless spirit of the human race. Admiral Jane Korvac stood at the helm of the U.S. Valiant, her eyes fixed on the stars. The war had reached a critical juncture. Despite humanity's growing success, the Dominion and Corthan had not yet been fully broken. They still controlled vast territories, their fleets still outnumbered humanity's forces. The final battle was coming, and Korvac knew that it would take more than mere tactics to win. It would take a decisive, all-out strike to cripple the enemy once and for all. "We've played their game long enough," Korvac said, her voice steady but filled with resolve. "It's time to end it. We'll make them fight on our terms." Her plan was bold. The Valiant would lead a surprise assault on the Va capital world, Vizai Prime, the heart of their empire. This would force the Dominion to divert their fleet from the ongoing battles in other sectors, giving humanity the opportunity to launch coordinated strikes against Corthan-controlled worlds and cripple their war machine. It was a gamble, and the odds were still stacked against them. But humanity had learned to thrive in chaos. And this time, they would use the very nature of their enemy's arrogance against them. The operation, codenamed Black Dawn, began with a series of coordinated decoy attacks across Dominion and Corthan space. In the chaos that followed, human fleets scattered across the galaxy engaged in hit-and-run tactics, targeting weak points, drawing the enemy's forces out of position. Meanwhile, intelligence gathered from the rogue factions within the Dominion and Ascendancy provided a vital advantage: the precise location of Va defensive vulnerabilities. As the Corthan struggled to respond to Tarkar's mutiny and the shifting allegiances within their own ranks, the Dominion forces found themselves overwhelmed on multiple fronts. The warlords could not afford to ignore the human threat much longer. The trap was set. Admiral Korvac's fleet, leading the charge toward Vizai Prime, moved under the cover of a massive solar storm, hiding their movements from Dominion sensors. The Va, distracted by reports of human victories on other fronts, underestimated the scale of the attack. By the time they realized what was happening, it was already too late. Korvac's forces descended upon Vizai Prime with the fury of a storm. Human ships, reinforced by defected Va warlords and powered by stolen Dominion technology, tore into the planet's defenses. Waves of human fighters and bombers, coordinated with terrifying precision, struck key military installations and communication hubs, crippling the Dominion's ability to mount a coordinated defense. The U.S. Valiant herself led the assault, her weapons blazing as she rained fire upon Va warships attempting to launch counterattacks. The battle was fierce, but humanity's superior tactics and sheer willpower turned the tide in their favor. The Va were caught in the same trap they had once set for countless others. Their hubris had led them to underestimate the very species they had once considered insignificant. On the Corthan front, General Tarkar's forces, emboldened by their alliance with humanity, struck at the heart of the Ascendancy's industrial core. The Corthan, already weakened by infighting and resource depletion, struggled to defend their critical supply lines. Tarkar's rebellion had now become an unstoppable force. The Corthan war machine, so mighty and feared just a few years ago, was beginning to disintegrate from within. As the Dominion forces fell into disarray and the Corthan Empire teetered on the edge of collapse, humanity made its final move. Korvac issued orders to all human fleets to converge on Vizai Prime, launching a full-scale assault on the remaining Va strongholds. It was now or never. In a final, desperate bid to salvage their dying empire, the Va attempted to regroup, hoping to mount a counteroffensive with their remaining forces. But the damage was done. The human forces had already shattered their command structure, and the once proud Dominion was now fighting a war they could not win. As the last remnants of Va resistance crumbled, Admiral Korvac stood on the bridge of the Valiant, watching as Vizai Prime burned. The final stage of the Infinite War was coming to an end, but the price of victory was steep. Entire worlds had been lost, millions of lives had been sacrificed, and the scars of the conflict would last for generations. But humanity had won. The Dominion had fallen. The Corthan Ascendancy, shattered from within, would never again pose a serious threat. And humanity? Humanity had not just survived, they had ascended. They were no longer a fledgling species, struggling to carve out their place in a galaxy of ancient empires. they had become the dominant force in the galaxy, masters of a new era. The Infinite War was over. But the story of humanity's rise had only just begun. The war had ended, but the galaxy was far from at peace. Humanity, having triumphed against impossible odds, now stood at the precipice of a new era, one they had never fully imagined. The Dominion had crumbled, the Corthan ascendancy lay in ruin, and the stars once ruled by ancient, mighty empires were now open to the human race. Yet with victory came the heavy weight of responsibility. Admiral Jane Korvac, now hailed as the savior of humanity, stood in the council chamber of the Terran Union's new capital on Terra Nova, humanity's gleaming, rebuilt homeworld. The war was over, but the future was uncertain. Humanity had become the galaxy's dominant power, but how would they wield that power? How would they govern, with so many former enemies still living in the shadows of the war's devastation? Korvac, still wearing the marks of war, scars both physical and emotional, stared at the galaxy map before her. The shattered remnants of the hfy Dominion, the Corthan systems in disarray, and the remnants of other minor powers that had been caught up in the chaos now lay in her hands. The human race had risen from the ashes of the Infinite War, but at what cost? "We've won, yes," she said to the council, her voice steady but weary. "But the real battle begins now. The peace we fought for is fragile. We must rebuild, and we must unite the galaxy under a new order. It will not be easy. The galaxy is a vast, fragmented place, and we are now the shepherds of its future." Her words echoed in the hall. The council, composed of diplomats, generals, and former resistance leaders from every corner of the galaxy, nodded in agreement. They knew that the true challenge of humanity's rise would not be fought in space, but in the hearts and minds of the galaxy's inhabitants. The war had scarred civilizations, and the wounds would not heal quickly. Humanity's rise had been inevitable, yet many species in the galaxy still viewed them with a mix of awe, distrust, and even fear. They had seen how humans fought, and won, but they had also seen the destructive power humanity wielded. As the Terran Union's leadership began to rebuild, the question became, would humanity be a beacon of hope in the galaxy, or would they become the very tyrants they had fought against? In the wreckage of the Corthan ascendancy, General Tarker now stood with the remnants of his fleet, still loyal to the human cause but questioning the future. Tarker had fought beside humanity, had betrayed his own people for their survival, but what would his people become now that the war was over? The Corthan, a race once feared for their strength and savagery, had been reduced to near extinction. Tarker had promised them autonomy, but could humanity, after all they had endured, truly offer the Corthan a place in this new galaxy? His thoughts were interrupted by a transmission from Admiral Korvac. "Tarker," her voice came through the comms, clear and calm. "We need to talk. You've earned a seat at the table. But there's more at stake now than just our survival. It's time for us to decide what kind of galaxy we want to build." Tarker nodded grimly. The Corthan were a broken people, but he believed they could find new purpose. Still, he could not shake the nagging feeling that this peace might only be a temporary lull before the storm. Meanwhile, in the heart of the former hfy Dominion, the last remnants of the Dominion's ruling council had been captured. These were the warlords, the architects of the galactic conflict who had once sought to impose their will on the entire galaxy. Now, they were prisoners, their power shattered. Humanity had a choice: would they execute them as traitors, ensuring no chance for future rebellion, or would they grant them mercy and force them to live with their failure? A delegation of human diplomats, led by Commander Alana Reeve, arrived on Vizai Prime, the charred remains of the Dominion's capital. The atmosphere was tense. There was no going back for these former rulers of the galaxy, they had lost everything. Reeve, representing the ideals of the Terran Union, sought a path forward that would heal the rifts between humanity and the defeated empires. "I know they're criminals," Reeve said, her voice measured as she addressed the council. "But if we execute them without mercy, what makes us any different from the tyrants we fought? The galaxy has suffered enough bloodshed. We must show them what it means to rebuild, not destroy. It was a controversial stance, but it echoed the sentiment Korvac had expressed: humanity's rise must not be one of vengeance, but of rebuilding and forging alliances with those willing to join them. The galaxy's future would depend not on destruction, but on cooperation. The fate of the Dominion warlords was decided. They would live, but they would be stripped of power, exiled to the farthest reaches of the galaxy to serve as a reminder of what happens when empires fall into tyranny. Yet, not all the remnants of the old empires would be so easily silenced. In the far reaches of space, a rogue faction of hfy loyalists, hiding deep within the asteroid fields of the Outer Rim, began to stir. They had watched humanity's rise with suspicion and jealousy. Their hatred for humanity burned bright, and they were not yet ready to accept their defeat. These outcasts, led by an enigmatic figure known only as the Shadow of Sci, began plotting in the dark corners of the galaxy. They would not let their empire die so easily. Humanity's reign, still in its infancy, was threatened once more, not by a rival empire, but by the ghosts of the past. As the galaxy took its first breaths in this new era, it became clear that humanity's victory had only just begun. The war might have ended, but the true test of their endurance was yet to come. The galaxy, once a theater of untold destruction, now seemed eerily silent. The infinite war had ravaged entire star systems, leaving behind scorched planets and broken civilizations. Humanity had emerged victorious, their flags now planted in the heart of the galaxy. But even as they celebrated their triumph, the shadows of past enemies lingered. The warlords of the Dominion and the shattered Korthan ascendancy had been defeated, but not all were ready to accept that defeat. Admiral Jane Korvac stood before a holographic map of the galaxy, the dim blue glow illuminating her weathered face. The council chamber, once filled with triumphant shouts and hopeful promises, was now heavy with tension. Humanity had won, but now they had to face the delicate work of maintaining control over a galaxy of fractured, war-torn worlds. The Terran Union had grown rapidly, expanding its reach across vast swaths of the galaxy. New colonies were being established, alliances forged with former enemies, and territories once controlled by the Dominion or Korthan were now under human governance. But not all species had embraced this new reality. The Korthan are fractured, but their warlords still linger in the Outer Rim, Korvac remarked to the council, her tone grim. And the hfy loyalists, they have become a specter. The Shadow of Sci is not merely a figurehead, he's a symbol of what they lost, and they will not forget. Indeed, the remnants of the old powers had not quietly vanished. The Shadow of Sci, a former hfy general whose face was now as much a symbol of the Dominion's defeat as it was of its hope for rebirth, had become a rallying point for those who would not accept their fall. A growing faction of hfy rebels, disillusioned, broken, and enraged, began to regroup, striking from the fringes of space, sabotaging human supply lines, and sowing fear among the newly minted Terran Union worlds. We've already seen their attacks on our trade routes, Commander Alana Reeve spoke up, her voice sharp. We can't afford to ignore them. If we allow these factions to continue operating, they'll gain support, both from within the Dominion remnants and from systems still hostile to our rise. Korvac nodded. She knew the risks. We will have to deal with them, swiftly. But we cannot be seen as tyrants. The galaxy has suffered too much for us to rule through fear. Yet, even as Korvac laid out plans to root out the rebels, the cracks within the Terran Union's newfound peace began to show. The galaxy was not a unified whole, and not all species viewed humanity's rise favorably. Many of the smaller factions, having weathered the war by aligning with either the Dominion or Korthan, now found themselves marginalized in the wake of humanity's dominance. Resentment simmered beneath the surface, and some of these factions began whispering of rebellion. Tarkar, the Korthan general turned ally, now found himself in a precarious position. While humanity had given his people a voice, he was unable to silence the factions within his own race who longed for the glory days of the Korthan ascendancy. Some viewed Tarkar's willingness to ally with humans as betrayal, others saw him as a symbol of Korthan weakness. In the midst of this, Tarkar knew that he had to make a choice. Would he help lead his people into a new age of cooperation with humanity, or would he give in to the pressure from those who wanted to re-establish Korthan dominance, possibly at the cost of all that humanity had fought for? In a quiet corner of space, Tarkar called a secret meeting with Korvac. His fleet, though loyal to him, was divided. There are those among my people who seek to return to the old ways. They do not trust humanity, nor should they. The Korthan were once rulers, not subjects. My position as their leader is fragile. I fear that soon, the cracks within our alliance will break wide open. Korvac listened intently, the weight of his words sinking in. The Korthan are not the only ones who are restless. The Va Shar loyalists are regrouping. We've seen signs of unrest in the outer colonies, and they're not all from those who want peace. Some believe humanity's victory is a fluke, others, like the Shadow, are fueling rebellion. We need to decide, are we going to bend to these factions and fight another war, or are we going to show the galaxy that the cycle of conquest ends with us? Tarkar's expression hardened. We've fought too long to lose now, but I fear there is more danger in appeasing these factions than you realize. Some wars, even after the battle's end, never truly cease. Korvac looked at him, eyes hard with determination. Then we must prepare for whatever comes next. But we will fight in the light, not in the shadows. Our victory was not just over empires. It was a victory over the cycle of endless war. And we cannot let it continue. Yet, unbeknownst to them, another threat was rising, not from a distant faction, but from within the heart of the Terran Union itself. The power that humanity had fought so hard to attain was beginning to corrupt those in power. The Terran Union's leaders, now swarming with politicians eager to claim influence, began squabbling over territories and resources. The unity that had won the war was fracturing as the ambitious and the power-hungry began to play their games of politics. A new faction, led by high-ranking members of the Union's government, began to question the very ideals that had united humanity. Some began to argue that the time for mercy had passed, that humanity should impose its will, ruthlessly, upon the galaxy. The idea of peace, they argued, was naive, and the galaxy would never truly accept humanity's rule unless they were shown dominance. As tensions mounted, the galaxy held its breath. The war had ended, but the echoes of the past would not remain silent. The galaxy, which had been shaped by endless cycles of war, was now at a crossroads. Humanity had triumphed over the Dominion and Korthan ascendancy, but their victory came with the responsibility of keeping the galaxy united in peace. However, beneath the surface of the Terran Union's fragile governance, dark currents were stirring, currents of ambition, division, and dissent. Admiral Jane Korvac stood before the assembled leadership of the Terran Union in the great chamber of Terra Nova's capital. Her eyes scanned the room, filled with politicians, diplomats, and military leaders, some who had fought alongside her, others who had risen to power in the aftermath of the war. Their faces were a mixture of hope and skepticism. Despite the victory, there was no denying the rifts beginning to tear apart the Union. Korvac had always been a military leader, a strategist, and a fighter. But now, she was confronted with a new challenge, keeping her people united when some were ready to abandon the ideals of peace for the power of conquest. We won the war, but the peace is slipping through our fingers, she said, her voice carrying the weight of both the triumph and the struggle that followed. There are those among us who believe that victory was not enough. That to secure humanity's future, we must show the galaxy who truly rules. Her eyes locked on a few faces in the room. The cycle of conquest that we sought to break is not yet over. It has only taken on a new form. A murmur rippled through the chamber. Korvac had spoken the truth. There were factions within the Union, powerful factions, who no longer saw peace as a sustainable option. Some of the politicians, hungry for power and emboldened by humanity's newfound dominance, had begun to argue that the galaxy would never accept humanity's rule unless they imposed it. The ideals of cooperation and rebuilding seemed quaint to them now. They saw only opportunity in the wake of the war's devastation. And it wasn't just within the Union that dissent brewed. In the outer colonies, old allies were growing restless. The Korthan, while grateful for humanity's assistance, were divided between those who sought peace and those who longed for the glory of the old ascendancy. General Tarker's position had become precarious, as more factions within the Korthan military whispered of rebellion, longing to return to their warlike ways. He had spent years convincing his people to accept a new future, but it seemed that the old ways would not die so easily. Meanwhile, the Va Shar loyalists, still under the leadership of the Shadow of Vazai, were expanding their influence from the Outer Rim. Though the Va Shar had been defeated, their ideology, their thirst for vengeance, had not been extinguished. The Shadow was not merely a symbol, he was a rallying point for those who refused to accept humanity's victory. Their strikes against human territories grew bolder, fueled by the belief that humanity's rise was not their destiny to cede. Korvac knew that the galaxy could not survive under this constant tension. It was clear, the war might have ended, but the fight for the galaxy's soul was just beginning. "Do we become the very thing we fought against?" she asked the council, her voice rising with the gravity of the question. "Will we resort to tyranny and subjugation, just as the Dominion once did? Or will we show the galaxy that there is another way, that humanity can be both strong and just?" For a moment, silence hung in the air. Then, Tarker stood, his massive form looming over the table. The scars of war still marked his face, but his eyes reflected a deep wisdom earned through hardship. "I fought alongside humanity because I believed in this vision. The Korthan have always fought for dominance, but we never knew peace. If we want a future, it must be built on something greater than power. We cannot allow the darkness to consume us again. The galaxy has suffered enough." His words carried weight, and for a time, they stilled the room. But not all agreed. A human senator named David Kor, a rising star in the political sphere, spoke up, his voice sharp with a different vision. "What Tarker says is noble, but naive. The galaxy does not bend to mercy, it bends to strength. We've won because we were willing to fight. To show our enemies that we are not to be trifled with. If we allow weakness now, the galaxy will fall into chaos again, and this time, humanity won't have the luxury of another war to survive it." Kor's words hit like a blow. The room erupted into heated debate, with factions forming along old lines, those who clung to ideals of peace and cooperation, and those who saw domination as the only path forward. Korvac watched, her mind racing. She had always believed that the strength of humanity lay in its unity, its refusal to be broken by adversity. But now, she faced a terrible truth: unity was fragile, and the very victory they had fought for was being torn apart by the forces of ambition and fear. Outside the chamber, the galaxy seemed to hang in the balance. The remnants of the Dominion and Korthan were still struggling to rebuild, and the Shadow of Vazai's rebels were growing more organized. Humanity's influence had spread, but so had their enemies. The question now was not whether humanity could survive, but whether it would become a beacon of hope, or another empire lost to time. In a final act of leadership, Korvac took a deep breath and stood, her presence commanding silence. "We have built this union on the belief that there is more to strength than conquest. That our place in the galaxy is not one of tyranny, but of cooperation. I will not let us fall into the same darkness that we fought to end. But the galaxy is not simply ours to rule. It is ours to guide, to lead by example. If we are to survive, we must show the galaxy that strength and mercy can exist together." With those words, Korvac set the course for the Terran Union's future, a future where the mistakes of the past would not be repeated, but where humanity would have to fight, not with weapons, but with ideals. The road ahead would not be easy. The galaxy was filled with old wounds, new enemies, and lingering doubts. But humanity had faced the infinite war and emerged victorious. Now, it was time to prove that victory could be something more than just survival. It could be a beginning.